This is Paul Schmid. Welcome to the Pursuit Zone. For 24 days, Charlie Tokeley trekked and packrafted a remote stretch of Chilean Patagonia, documenting previously unexplored glaciers and traversing unnamed rivers. During this time, he saw not a single person or sign of human activity. He describes it as breathtakingly stunning at times and inexplicably hard the rest, a rainbow in a rainstorm. You can learn more about the adventure at charlietokeley.wordpress.com. Charlie Tokeley, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Thanks for having me.
Charlie, how did you get interested, first of all, in doing adventures such as this one?
I guess I've always been interested in traveling and seeing new places. Adventures such as this one, I guess they're not kind of typical traveling. So I've done a few trips before. I think when I was about 18, I did a trip with one of my best friends to Sweden, and it all went completely wrong. Well, we spent 30 days out in the wild that time. It was kind of a funny experience because I didn't do any planning for that trip. I just kind of tagged along with it. And my friend, it turned out, didn't do any planning either. So we went and camped out, and we got bitten by swathes and swathes of mosquitoes. We didn't have very good food, and we couldn't really walk because it was all marsh. So it was kind of a terrible introduction to this kind of trip. But as time went on, I did a bit more traveling, kind of standard stuff. I went backpacking in Asia and things like this. And I got quite disappointed with seeing the same places that everybody else sees. So a trip like this, I guess, I did an exchange in Chile for my third year of university. And I kind of felt like I wanted to get to know the country on a deeper level than most people get to see it. Chile is a huge country. And I figured that instead of just going to the tourist hotspots, which you can find, you can just Google tourism Chile and you can find kind of 4 or 5 places which will come up every single time in every single tourist guide. I decided I wanted to try and figure out what was in the places between and the places outside of these places. And so I started to look for interesting places, and I found out that basically Patagonia is not just these 2 kind of hotspots of tourism which it's usually shown to be. And then I started to kind of look into how to go to somewhere like this and how to visit some of these more off the beaten track places. And I figured out that there were all sorts of different elements involved in it. And so I kind of just started getting into the different element, things like kayaking, things like trekking, that would eventually lead me to doing this trip. So it's kind of a big mixture of lots of different things. I had a bad experience the first time, but then it kind of stayed with me forever, that I kind of enjoyed this feeling of being outside, enjoyed this feeling of doing something a little bit unusual, and seeing a different place that other people don't get to see.
Then Charlie, for this adventure then, did you plan a little bit more than the trip to Sweden?
Well, I did, yeah. This time I had to plan things a lot more thoroughly. Yeah, this time I spent a very long time planning. So when I was doing my exchange, this is now about 3 years ago. When I was doing my exchange, I decided that this was something I wanted to do. And so I started to think about how to do it. And as I say, I started to do things like kayaking and go trekking more regularly. I realized that there were all sorts of other things involved in it as well in planning a trip like this. It wasn't just going to be kind of going off on a normal trip, hiking on trails, and it was a big undertaking. So I had to look at every single different aspect, and I didn't have a lot of experience in doing these kind of things. I hadn't got a big background in mountaineering like a lot of people do that do these kind of trips. So I had to start thinking about things like how to pack food, how to be safe, emergency procedures, what to do in terms of crossing and camping in a marsh, for example, or on beaches with bad weather. There were all sorts of different elements involved, which I wasn't really prepared for at first. I didn't realize quite how much planning it would require. This kind of dragged it out because first off, I was going to do it when I was studying there. So I would have had about 3 months from when I first decided on where to go until going to plan the whole thing and to buy any extra equipment I needed. And as time went on, I started to realize that it wasn't enough time to prepare myself for it. I needed to be more adept with certain skills, and I needed certain equipment which I simply couldn't afford to buy or couldn't decide which equipment to take. And so in that case, I decided not to do it that year and to delay it. And I had to go back and finish my university degree. So that meant delaying it by 2 years. And you'd think that with 2 years to plan something, you can do things pretty thoroughly and pretty easily with lots of time. But throughout that whole period, I was looking at equipment, I was looking at routes, I was looking at different skills that I might need to fine tune. And so in the end, it turned into this kind of big 3-year plan to do something. It was kind of the most drawn out thing I think I've ever done. It was a big build up for what was essentially only 24 days of an experience.
Do you enjoy the planning?
Do I enjoy the planning? Well, I enjoy the dreaming. I enjoy the dreaming which comes first. The planning quickly wears thin and you start to get bored of certain things. When I first got the idea to do it, it seemed like the most inspiring thing. Towards the end of it, I hated it. I really did. It became this burden, which, I'm thinking, I can't wait to just do this trip and have it behind me and then I can move on to something else. It really consumed me to quite a staggering degree. I was consumed by this trip. So no, I enjoyed the dreaming, but I didn't enjoy the planning.
So tell me about then what came out of your planning in terms of your kit. Explain to me what you've got in terms of tent, your provisions and so on, and then also your pack raft. What can you tell me about those items?
It was kind of an interesting thing. I couldn't just decide on the best individual pieces of gear. I had to think of everything as a whole. So every piece of gear that I bought was bought with the rest of the gear in mind. So for example, my tent, I decided I needed it to be as light and space efficient as possible because this was thought of as a long duration trip and I couldn't carry that much stuff. There's a limit to what any one person can carry on their back. So my tent was a floorless tent, more like a tarp. It's a pyramid tent. So it was held up by a trekking pole in the middle. It was a one-man tent. I bought it because from all the reading up on things I'd done and all the kind of comparing different tents, I decided it was probably the best one for windy conditions, for traveling lightweight and for being kind of versatile. So I bought that and then I started to think about the other things. So for example, my sleeping bags take up so much space in a backpack. So I was looking into how to try and reduce that without kind of compromising my warmth. I didn't want to freeze when I was out there. So I ended up buying it's a bit of a controversial decision when I bought it, a down quilt. So a quilt, as in it doesn't have the part which you sleep on. It's a quilt. It's not a sleeping bag. And down was also kind of controversial because it rains a lot in that part of Chile. I don't know how much rainfall it has per year, but when I was there, it rained the majority of the days. So down was a bit of a tricky choice. Am I going to be able to keep that dry? And then things like my packraft were givens. The packraft I have is the biggest, or it was the biggest packraft that Alpaca produced, Alpaca being the main brand of packrafts. And I bought the biggest one because I am nearly 6'5" tall. It was the only boat I could fit into. And also I was going to have a lot of gear, heavy gear. I needed something which would float with everything on top of it. So yeah, I had a big pack raft. I had a lot of gear. Then finally, the final thing was trying to find a backpack which could fit everything in. And so I did a practice trip, which I'm sure we'll get onto a little bit later, but I did a practice trip in Norway the summer before, so it was last August now. And the backpack I had was a 30-pound backpack. It was a 90-litre backpack that I bought off Amazon several years before, and it had done me really well traveling around the place beforehand. But with a heavy load, I carried 30 kilograms on that trip, and it began to fall apart. And by the end of the trip, I had only the main the main interior of the bag was still intact. I had no pockets on the outside. Loads of the straps are broken. And so I needed to buy a different backpack. So I bought a massive 110-litre backpack for this trip. It was the only thing I could really take to fit everything in.
Did you have any prior pack rafting experience?
I did, yeah. I was kind of self-taught, I guess you could say. I guess most pack rafters are self-taught to a degree. Well, let's see. I bought the pack rafts when I was on my exchange about 3 years ago with this very trip in mind. Nearly all the gear I have was with this trip in mind. So I bought the pack raft, and then what was the first thing I did? I traveled down northern Patagonia for about 6 weeks with this packraft, and basically jumped from river to river and fjord to fjord, lake to lake. Did a bit of an unconventional style of traveling. Most people hitchhike or they rent a car or something to travel down that part of the world, but I kind of did both. I hitchhiked sometimes and I paddled the rest of the way. So it breaks up into lots of fjords in that part of Patagonia. And instead of taking the ferry, I kayaked for 4 days in my packraft. And so I'd done quite a few small trips. I think the longest I did was about 6 days alone, which didn't need to be 6 days. It was like a 4 day trip, but I spun it out because I was having a good time. And then I started to think about some longer trips, mainly to build up to this big trip. The Norway trip, it was a packrafting trip. I did it with one of my best friends who was also into this kind of thing. He bought a very cheap, low-end packraft, which was more a dinghy than a packraft, and he suffered a bit as a result. But we decided we're going to do a packrafting trip in Norway. And it was a 16-day trip, so I got to try it out there on fjords. We descended a few rivers for the first time, I think, in packrafts in Norway. And then I did another trip in southern Patagonia, a lot further down in the Magallanes region. You might know the park Torres del Paine, which is a very famous park down there. So I started there, and I was going to do a 16-day trip. This was like my final build-up to this main trip, and it was a catastrophe. Without going into too much detail, it was going to be a 16-day trip, and it turned into a 5-day trip. I had terrible weather. I hated being alone. It was really unusual, and I felt cold the whole time. I ended up getting ill. It was a really bizarre and disappointing failure, but it was also kind of scary because it built me up or set me off on a bad footing for this main trip. But yeah, so I did have some packrafting experience. Most of the time, with the exception of that trip in southern Patagonia and the Norway trip, before this trip, it would be mainly descending rivers and crossing lakes just to kind of play around with it. But some of it had been, relatively challenging as well.
So what did you learn from these two trips, the Norway and the other one that you mentioned, that prepared you for this 24-day adventure?
What I didn't learn on the Norway trip, I learned on the Magallanes trip and vice versa. So on the Norway trip, I realized just how much fun it was to be outdoors. I'd finished university a few months earlier, and I spent far too much time reading books and being sat at a desk. And, I really wanted to just get outside and do something. So the Norway trip was incredibly refreshing. I enjoyed it so much. I think it's the most enjoyable trip I've done, far more enjoyable than this big trip, which I did in terms of enjoyment, in terms of pure enjoyment. I learned a lot from that as well. We practiced quite a few times making fires in some pretty terrible weather conditions. When there was a lot of rain, we decided, let's practice now. So we learned some skills like that. My friend didn't have any packrafting experience, so I was river leader for those trips, which was a lot of fun. But it also meant I had to really think about what the dangers were on the river. It was very good exercise for me because it wasn't just my safety at risk, it was also his. Far more educational was the second trip, the one which was a failure. I got to test out my equipment. The equipment most of it was okay, but I learned that being alone and doing trips alone isn't something which you can take lightly. It's something which you have to really be in the right mindset for. So for this trip, I'd just arrived in Chile about 8 days beforehand, and I'd seen some friends. I caught up with some people in Santiago, but when I went down to the south and got ready to go on this trip, I kind of felt like I'd not really prepared myself for it. I'd just say goodbye to my parents. I'd wave goodbye to my family. I'd wave goodbye to some friends in Santiago. And I kind of felt like everything I wanted to do and the place I wanted to be was in the city. So I was never really in the mindset from the start. And I guess what I learned from that is that it's something which, if you're going to do a trip alone, you need that time to think and that space to think. You need that solitude. If you expose yourself to it without that necessity, then it's actually something which is very unpleasant. Especially in a big wild area, you kind of feel pretty small, but not in an enlightening way. You feel small in a far greater way. You kind of feel insignificant within yourself.
How much time passed between the 5-day trip and then now this 24-day adventure?
I did the 5-day trip at the start of November, and then this 24-day trip I did midway through January until midway through February. There was a month and a half, couple of months in there to pull everything together. It was a very uncertain period because when I finished that 5 day trip, I started to doubt everything about the 24-day trip. I remember thinking on the 5 day trip, there's no way I want to do this trip. I don't want to be alone for this long. I don't want to, it's uncomfortable sometimes if you're not in the mood for it. It's uncomfortable to be walking through thick forests in terrible rain when you're a little bit hungry, and the best thing you've got that evening is to lie in a sleeping bag and listen to that rain around you. It's not necessarily something pleasant. So it was a very uncertain period where I started to doubt whether that was something I actually enjoyed or not. I wondered whether it was a good idea to actually do the trip. I had time to think about it and pull some stuff together. It was kind of an unpleasant period of time where I always felt a little bit in limbo. I never knew whether it was going to happen or whether it was something I spent so much time and energy on, which was in fact a big failure. It was, very uncertain.
Well, did you ever think of inviting someone else along?
Many times I invited other people along, but part of me wanted company and part of me didn't. I invited a lot of people that I know to come along with me and that I knew would be up for this kind of trip. But as you probably garnered by now, it's a massive commitment. And there were very few people who had the time to do it and very few people who had the money to buy the equipment that was necessary. And also, I was pretty picky. I didn't want to go along with anyone. I wanted to go along with somebody that I would get along with, and that it wouldn't spoil the journey. If I went along with someone that actually we start to annoy each other or whatever. So I invited people along, but nobody could do it. And then it was a big point of contention whether I was going to do it solo or not. Obviously, there's a lot of risks involved in going solo, but in the end, I decided to do it solo because I wanted to do it either way. If I was going to do it solo or if I was not going to do it, I would do it solo. If it came down to a choice between doing it or not doing it, I figured it would be better just to get on and do it, and I'd learn a lot about myself and a lot more about the place as well. Like anything, if you're alone, you tend to listen to what's around you a lot more. So I didn't see it as a completely negative thing going alone.
Let's talk a little bit more in detail of this adventure. How do you get to the starting point?
From Santiago, I had to get a flight down to Coyhaique, which is kind of the capital of northern Patagonia. And then from there, it was a 5-hour bus journey to a small town on the edge of the biggest lake in Chile. And then from there, it was another, 2 hours through a valley by a car to get to a river. And on the river, there were two separate boats, if I remember. Yeah, two separate boats in total to get to where I started, which were it was about 5 hours in boat from there through rivers and fjords to get there. That was all done. Well, obviously anyone can take a flight and anyone can take a bus or a car. The boat to get to where I started was a tourist boat. It was a tourist trip, so I accompanied them, and they were the people who picked me up at the end as well.
So from my research, I learned that you had to check in with some rangers before you started. What was their reaction to your trip?
It was kind of a mixture of surprise, enthusiasm, and doubt. Probably those three things more than anything. It was really nice to speak to them and get some information off them to get their opinions. They were quite young guys, actually. They were only a little bit older than I am. They've been living and working there for a few years, each of them. They'd seen a few other expeditions go through there before. They knew a lot of the places by name, but I was kind of surprised because I thought they'd have visited the places, even if it was, getting a short Parks Agency funded flight across to check out the glaciers or getting a boat round or something to check out. I don't know, that it's a big park and you'd have thought that they would patrol it from time to time, but they only knew the places when I pointed at them on the map or some of them by name. For them, it was also kind of like something a little bit awe-inspiring. They thought it was quite cool that I was going to be going there, and they thought it was really cool that I was going to be going alone as well. They asked me quite a few times, are you sure you're capable of doing this? Are you sure you're experienced enough? And I always had to give them answers which were a little bit of a mixture between the truth and a lie, if I'm honest, because I wasn't really sure. I didn't really know what I was getting into. But yeah, it was a positive experience. It was kind of something that on that first night when the boat left me and I sat there alone in complete silence on the beach, I thought back to the conversation. I thought that was a pretty nice last social interaction to have. chirpy little park rangers, really, really nice people. And yeah, it was kind of a nice last touch of humanity to take me into a long period of solitude.
So was the 24 days just what it turned out to be, or was that a strict timetable?
Initially, it was going to be 28 days. I took food for 28 days, but I started to get towards arriving at the finish before that. I kind of felt like I'd achieved what I wanted to. There were no real objectives really about this trip. No kind of clear cut objective. It was kind of a bit of an unknown really from every single angle. I wanted to get into somewhere different and see some different places, but I felt like I'd achieved that well and truly within about 15, 16 days when I started to head back. I arrived at the pickup point on day 23, and I'd already been in contact with my emergency contacts in Santiago to coordinate a boat back. Bad weather was coming on what would have been day 25, and it would have been doubtful whether any boats would have been able to come and pick me up. So I decided it made sense to get picked up on that 24th day and get out of there, rather than sticking around and seeing, if I could complete the 28 days that I'd initially set out to do just to say that I'd done 28 days. It didn't really make much sense. It wasn't that strictly timetabled. I kind of feel like with these things, unless there's a specific reason to have a strict timetable, usually something negative if you try and structure these things too much. It's nice to have little objectives, but I kind of wanted to just have fun above everything else.
What did you have for communication equipment?
I had a DeLorme InReach. It's a little satellite messenger, two-way messenger. I didn't take a satellite phone, which was actually a requirement of one of the permits I had to get, but in the end it turned out to be something which was pretty difficult to acquire. So I went with this satellite messenger, which was definitely the next best thing. And I could send text messages. They would arrive as emails or text messages. And people could send me messages back. It would show my coordinates. It turned out to be a really, really positive thing. It also had an SOS button in the event of something going wrong.
Just to go back to one point here, you said that the satellite phone was a requirement to get a permit.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get away with it then not having it?
There's a permit from the government, from the Borders Agency, which is required to do a trip there. Essentially, I gave them the number of the satellite phone which I was going to rent. But then when I went to pick up the satellite phone, there'd been a mix-up and they couldn't give me the satellite phone. And this was a day before I went off my trip. There had been some massive mix-up. It just wasn't going to be possible to get hold of another satellite phone at late notice. So I went with what I had, which was this messenger. Also, it was a requirement. Now, this sounds a little bit unfair, but it was a requirement more than anything for them rather than for me. I think it was more something, again, it sounds a bit unfair, but I think it was more something to make them feel safe that if they need to get in touch with me, they could do that rather than for me. A lot of trips have gone on in the same region and in other parts of the world without satellite phones and with these messengers, and they, for 99% of the things, are very accurate. They work on, for example, my satellite messenger works on the same system as a satellite phone I was going to use. So in terms of signal, it would have been the same. The only thing is I wouldn't be able to have a spoken conversation in the event of something happening to me. It was something I resented going without a satellite phone, because I wanted to do what they asked me for on the permit. But again, it came down to an option: do it or don't do it. And at that point, I'd already committed so much to it that I wanted to go either way. So I went with the best thing I could, which I considered to be a pretty good option anyway. I had to kind of miss out on the satellite phone.
I'm just going to read through some things I wrote down here, some highlights of your trip. 220 kilometers through a patchwork of marshes, mountains, glaciers, forests. You camped in front of 7 glaciers. You paddled 6 rivers. You walked along 35 kilometers of uninterrupted beach. You spent 3 days trapped in a tent in front of a glacier. The one that sticks out in my mind is that 35 kilometers of uninterrupted beach. What was that like?
Long. It was long. It was stunningly beautiful, but it was very exposed to the elements as well. It was tiring. It was at the start of my trip. I had a very heavy backpack at that point. I had to split it up into 2 separate days. Uninterrupted, well, it was uninterrupted, but apart from one river, which it was the only interruption, I had to cross that in the packraft, and I camped on that river. But across that beach, I saw I saw whales. I had some pretty varied weather conditions, and I had the constant view of the San Quintin Glacier, which is the biggest glacier in the northern Patagonian ice field. I saw a huge variety of birds and dolphins nearly the whole time. There were dolphins or seals bobbing around, vultures feeding on a sea lion carcass. It was kind of like an interesting zoological trek across that beach. It was stunningly beautiful, but also, as I said, it was very exposed to the weather. It's on an isthmus, which is completely flat, and in Western Patagonia. So it's kind of like these two things imply a bit of a lack of protection from the weather. I had some pretty strong winds when I was walking along that beach. I had pretty much constant bouts of rain. The clouds were they're kind of like warships the whole time and just coming overhead and dropping just huge buckets of rain over me, and then disappearing, and then sun would come out again, and then it would happen again. It was one of the more beautiful parts of the trip. It was kind of very desolate, but at the same time, it was so rich in color and smells and variation. Just everything was so kind of sensual about the beach. I guess it's a bit of an overly poetic way of describing that, but it was a very sensual part of the trip.
What turned out to be the most challenging part of this adventure for you?
Well, giving you a bit of a politician's answer, this could be broken down into three different things: physical, emotional, and mental. Each of them had really difficult elements to them. Physically, without a shadow of doubt, probably to a certain extent mentally and emotionally as well. Any period where I had to go through the forest was torture. The forest in that part of Patagonia is up to 6 times as thick as the thickest Amazon rainforest. It's incredibly thick. It's genuinely, there were times when I thought if there was one more twig in my way, I wouldn't be able to advance. The forest was horrible. It was physically absolutely dreadful. It was painful. I came out of the forest at the end of a hard day's walking, having made less than a kilometer per hour, bloodied and bloodied and sweaty from so much toil. Physically, it was very, very draining. Mentally, the challenge of knowing that you had a long time left, and at times knowing that I was a long way away from other people, was kind of challenging sometimes. There was one point where I reflected on it and thought, if somebody wanted to walk here and get to me, the nearest person is 7 days walk minimum away if they were going to walk. That was kind of a mental challenge. And then emotionally, the uncertainty of things. Solitude wasn't nearly as big a factor as I thought it would be, but the uncertainty was in a sense of I could never take anything for granted. So even when I had my best days, I could never really feel as though, okay, that's job done. I always had this feeling of at any moment something could go wrong, which could really spoil the trip or worse. You know, it was this feeling of, okay, so I've just had a great day walking around. It's been sunny. It's been easy walking. I've seen some beautiful glaciers or lakes or whatever. Tomorrow I got to descend this river. What's going to happen with the weather? What if there's a log in the river which I don't see until the last moment? Or, you know, there's a great deal of uncertainty in it, and that kind of frightened me from the perspective of my family and my friends. I wouldn't be the one who suffered if something went wrong to me. I would, you know, I'd probably be dispatched up pretty quickly out there, but they would suffer and it'd be prolonged. So that was something which kind of taxed me a lot. It was a big challenge of the trip.
What do you remember as being some of your best days out there?
Certainly the day I got to the 2 undocumented glaciers, that was a fantastic day. There was nothing that went wrong that day. Oh, there was actually. There was one really weird moment where I just got a nosebleed and I didn't really know why. It just happened. But no, that day was sensational. I woke up, I had a good breakfast, and I set off through this little canyon at the top of the valley above where I camped, and then summited upon this tiny little hill at the top of the canyon, and there in front of me was this beautiful long lake with this huge tumbling glacier coming down into it at the end, which, as far as I'm aware, nobody has got to on foot before. And then after that, I spent the day skirting around the edge of the glacier, climbed up onto a mountain next to it, beside it, a very small mountain, but a mountain nonetheless. The view from the top was about 30 kilometers of the northern Patagonian ice field. It was just this infinitely unraveling carpets of ice. It was just one of the most spectacular things I've ever seen. And on the other side of the hill was another undocumented glacier, which was far more kind of stubbier, I guess, in appearance, but it was very dramatic, huge chunks of ice, and yeah, just a fantastic day. And I got back and then had a really good meal and washed in the lake next to where I was and slept very comfortably that night. I guess other days, the other highlights days were kind of similar stories, going off and exploring. I rarely had a good day when I was moving. I had plenty of good moments, but the best days were always when I was camped somewhere and I went off with a smaller backpack, left all my stuff in the tent and went off and just kind of had fun. It's kind of like being a tourist in a city or something, just go off for a little day trip somewhere and with a little backpack and take some pictures, have a snack with a good view or something. And it was kind of like that. Those were the best days, without a doubt.
You don't by chance get to name these glaciers, do you?
I get to give my own name to them, but nobody else has to call them that. Unfortunately, I have looked into this, but there's some quite complicated laws around who can name geographical features in Chile, and I think it's pretty certain that I'm not the person who gets to name them. Unfortunately, I would propose some names otherwise, but no.
Okay, so no Tokeley Glacier.
No, I've tried. I've thought about all sorts of different techniques, maybe uploading photos to Google Earth and then like naming them just sneakily like Tokeley Glacier. And then in the future, if anyone goes near there, they'll be like, oh, Tokeley Glacier, because I saw it on Google Earth. I've tried that one, but no, I don't think it's going to stick.
What was your biggest takeaway from the expedition?
I think there's a lot of excitement that an expedition like this generates, and it kind of lets you know that you're capable of things when you put your mind to it. Not to be too cliched, but really, if you want to do something, you can do it. I didn't have sponsorship. I funded the whole thing on my own. I didn't have much experience. It was something which I built up to in my own way. It was something that I just put my mind to and really became quite dogged about doing. I remember the first time I sent an email asking for information related to the trip. I sent it in completely the wrong tone, but the idea remains. So I said, at the end of it, I said, whether you give me this information or not, I'm going to do this trip. So for my own safety, please give me this information. And as I say, the tone was all wrong about it, but the fact is I was so determined to do this trip. I also think I learned a lot about how selfish these trips are as well. If something goes wrong to you out there, you're not the one who suffers. And I became acutely aware of this at several points in the trip, that I would suffer, I'm sure, if I was to drown or something like this, if the worst case scenarios happened. But it was stressful for my family and for my friends and those who were trying to keep up to date with what was happening with me. Getting a text from my satellite phone was kind of, okay, one less day we have to wait now for him to get back safely. So it was actually a very taxing thing for my family and friends too. I think that's something I learned about these trips, that I've always thought of them as kind of trips into the freedom, into freedom and into nature is kind of like a way to readdress the imbalance of security and freedom that you get in the city. But it's really, it's only freedom for you, for your friends and family who might worry about you. Then it's something which is very restricting.
Does that mean no more solo adventures for you?
No, not at all. No, I'm quite a selfish person, I think, in that sense. I'll do plenty more solo trips, I think, but maybe nothing. Well, I've considered whether I'll do anything as long as this trip and as taxing as this trip. I think I will. It's kind of like a bug. When you're on the trip, you start to think, no, this is the last one I'm going to do. And then as soon as it finishes, the very, very same night I arrived back in civilization, I was thinking, where can I go next? It's quite incredible how fickle and how traitorous your memory can be in that situation. You kind of forget about all the pain and the endurance you had to go through. So yeah, I will be doing more trips. I want to do a few easy things. I promised myself on that trip that the next traveling I did would be something like a wine and cheese tour of France, or something like just ridiculously mundane, on which I would be very bored and which wouldn't present any challenge, physical or emotional challenge to me. So maybe I'm going to do something like that for a little while. But I've already got some other trips in the pipeline, which I'm thinking about and I'm building up to. But as of yet, I haven't got a massive solo trip on the horizon. There's nothing kind of planned for now, but there's plenty of ambition still.
When you got picked up by this tourist boat, was it full of tourists?
It wasn't kind of like camera happy tourists. They didn't kind of see me and start taking pictures of me or anything, but it was a Chilean family and a German family who had spent a night near the ranger's cabin on the other side of the lagoon. they were full of questions. So it was really strange having not spoken to anyone for 24 days to get on the boat, and then just question after question after question. I just felt exhausted after 20 minutes of conversation. I felt like I couldn't socialize, but it was really nice to kind of speak to people again. It was another thing which I learned, I guess, from the trip, is that we all get a little bit bored of talking to people at times. We all get a little bit bored of having to compromise and kind of get along with other people. But really, it's a very positive thing to have other people around you. And it's a very nice thing as well when you get that kind of human contact after such a long time when you've been alone. You learn to appreciate those things a lot more.
What did you learn from this adventure that you can apply to future ones?
Well, a lot about what I said before about doing trips alone, that you need to be ready for them. So I think that's something I can apply to future trips. Logistically, I've learned a lot in the planning and realization of this trip. I've learned a lot in terms of, skills and timings and all these kind of things. I've learned a lot about that. I think more than anything, just kind of being comfortable in uncomfortable places is very kind of my reading that I took for this trip was the Dhammapada, the Buddhist Bible, I guess. It was a very appropriate thing to read, trying to kind of see the positive aspects in some very uncomfortable moments is something which I think can be applied not just to these trips and the future trips I do, but to life in general.
What about your gear? Anything that did not work out as you expected or worked out much better than you thought it would?
There were some very important elements of my kit list which were missing. I didn't have a GPS. I didn't have that satellite phone. I didn't even have waterproof trousers, which is kind of a really polemic, controversial point. But I kind of got by well on everything. I think the only thing I would have liked to have had would have been waterproof trousers, and not for walking in, just for like being comfortable in camp. Because every time, on those 3 days I spent trapped in my tent by just rain and wind and horrible weather, it would have been very nice just to be able to go outside and walk around or something for a little while and come back to the tent with some waterproof trousers on. But I brought something called a rain kilt, which I figured would be a good alternative, and it wasn't right for this trip. It's kind of this, well, it's a kilt. It's like a dress of waterproof fabric, but it didn't really work in the walking through all the undergrowth and stuff. In terms of kit which went really right, pack rafts are just fantastic things. They filled me with inspiration. It's so much fun as well, just to be able to add that variety into your trips and not have to always walk or always paddle. You can kind of do a bit of a mixture, and sometimes you have the option to do either. So yeah, pack rafts definitely. And I tore my kit to pieces. Lots of things broke and lots of things got damaged, but probably the star piece of kit was duct tape. It saved me in many ways. I duct taped my watch when that broke. I duct taped my seat on my pack raft when that burst. I duct taped my paddle when something fell off it. I duct taped pretty much everything in my kit, my backpack as well. I guess duct tape is the star of the day.
I'm just reaching here with this question, but you've mentioned some things that make me think that you've done some research into ultralight camping and trekking, because you mentioned the down mat, the down comforter. You mentioned the tent, the tarp with the pole. You just mentioned the skirt, and these are all things that I've seen on people that are doing like Appalachian Trail and things like that want to go ultralight. Am I anywhere close to? Yeah,
you are. They are. I've looked a lot into the ultralight stuff planning for this trip, not because I'm kind of a gear freak or anything. I knew that I needed to be really careful on the amount of gear which I took. It needed to be more than being light. It needed to be compressible and small, just to fit everything into my pack. I knew that an extra 500 grams or an extra kind of few cube centimeters of space in my pack was less food, and less food would have been less comfort, and the food was very important. So I never really wanted to miss out on that. So I dipped into the ultralight side of things to try and pull everything together in a way which would be a bit more space and weight efficient. I'm not really one for spending lots of money on saving a few grams unless it's really required in this case, for example. For example, my pack raft, I thought long and hard about changing that one for a smaller pack raft. In the end, I decided, no, it's not worth it. I'm not going to spend lots more money on saving a few grams when I've got something which works for me. I had to make a decision today, actually. I was was going to buy a new jacket, which is something I've been saving up for a while, a new down fleece, because I've been quite cold out here recently, and I've got some small little mountaineering trips coming up, and I was thinking about buying a really expensive down jacket, and I ended up buying a 30 quid jacket, which will probably, probably be be a little bit cold if I do anything too extreme. But I've really got it into my head after this trip, in terms of buying the best equipment and making it last. But sometimes it requires a bit of a different approach. So I'm not ultralight 100%. I see the use of it, but I try not to stick to it too religiously.
Let's switch gears here because I want to, as I understand it, you're living in Santiago, and I want to understand why are you living in Santiago?
Well, I really enjoyed it when I came on my exchange down here. It seemed like a very interesting place. Santiago, maybe not so much. Chile, yes. Chile is an incredibly interesting and beautiful place. I think there's very few countries in the world that can rival Chile for natural beauty. Very, very few countries in the world. It's got so much variation. So Santiago is a good jumping off point to go and see that variation. To the north, it's got the Atacama Desert, and to the south, it's got forests, it's got glaciers, Antarctica, it's got sea, it's got mountains, it's got everything. So that was a big attraction for me. I had a big friend group here as well, a group of friends from my exchange. And I didn't really have any other plans either. So it seemed like a good thing to do when I finished university, just to kind of, I knew I wanted to come back and do this trip. So it kind of made sense to stay here for a little while afterwards instead of heading back to England and being bored there. I thought I would stick around here and see what happened for a little while.
Did you know how to speak Spanish before you moved there, or are you learning along the way?
I had learned for about 6 or 7 years at school before I did my exchange. So my exchange really kind of consolidated it. I thought I knew how to speak Spanish when I got down here, but then Chileans speak a very different version of Spanish. There's a lot of accent. There's a lot of different words in Chilean Spanish, and they speak very quickly. So I quickly found out that I wasn't as fluent as I thought. But I've been here now for a decent chunk of my life, and it's not really a problem nowadays.
How are you earning a living down there?
I'm teaching English at the moment. Teaching English online.
How do you enjoy that?
It's a mixed bag. So I teach English online, which means I'm kind of living a very different life as compared to that which I lived when I was on my expedition. Sorry, there's a car alarm going off outside.
Hopefully it'll stop.
There's constantly dogs barking. I'm surprised we haven't had anything so far. Oh, there you go. There you go. Okay, so the dog started barking now. It's a mixed bag of things. I find it to be a very useful job. It's kind of, there's opportunities all around the world to teach English, and it's a very good introductory job. It doesn't have much of a challenge to it, though. Sorry, it's dog. As soon as it's like smells personal, here's another dog. It's a dog, I guess. He starts barking. As soon as I got used to the grammar and things which we don't tend to think about when we're speaking English as natives, we don't tend to think about the grammar behind it. So as soon as I got around that, it became quite an easy job. But as you probably can imagine from these trips which I've described, I kind of like an element of challenge as well, and that's been something which has been missing. This past week I've started a new and a bit more of a challenging job, which is teaching English in bilingual classes to Brazilians. So I've got to use my very bad Portuguese to try and teach English to beginner Brazilians. So there's a little bit more of a challenge in it, but it's a short-term job. In a few months' time, I'm going to be moving back to England. So it's something which I'll always have as an opportunity. If I want to move somewhere new, I can teach English and do that until I find a different opportunity. But I don't see it as being my permanent job.
Charlie, what's next for you?
As I say, I'm moving back to England in September, and I am going to study a master's in social anthropology, Oxford University. Very lucky that they've let me in there. So I'm gonna study a master's in social anthropology, which will be a year. And then after that, I want to really commit to these trips and try and make some type of living out of it, or at least a living which will enable me to do more of these trips.
How can people contact you if they want to learn more about this adventure?
There's my blog, charlietokeley.wordpress.com, and I'm perfectly happy to receive emails as well. I love receiving emails. charlietokeley@aol.com. I'm not much of a Facebook person. I don't have Twitter. I'm not really an internet person. So those two methods are the best way. I won't give you my address to send a letter or anything. But yeah, my email address or my WordPress are the best ways.
And Tokeley is spelled Tokeley.
Exactly.
Charlie Tokeley, thanks for coming on the show and sharing the story of your 24-day Chilean packrafting and trekking adventure. Appreciate it. And also, I should mention, you can check this out on sidetrack.com, where you wrote an article and there's photographs of it and so on. So I'd encourage people to go check that out as well. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Recorded June 11th, 2016. For more great podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.